Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if Persia remained Zoroastrian. Persia is an interesting place. It has so much history around it, and well, I always like reading new stuff about its past because there was always so much going on, and also many researchers, they find new interesting discoveries. What most people don't realize is that Persia used to have a long Zoroastrian tradition. Nowadays, thanks to media in particular, we are used to associate Persia or Iran with Islam, especially Shia Islam. We then think about bearded men with a very serious mimic, with long black or grey white dresses, and also a turban. I'm speaking about the Ayatollah, for instance, or also the current president of Iran. It is said that this clothing style was brought by the Arabs and that it was bestowed to those who finished important religious studies. However, Iran or Persia was not always like that. And actually for the most of the time, well, they were Zoroastrian. Persia, after the conquest of the Arabs or early Muslims, was not immediately converted, and it took hundreds of years to have a Muslim majority within Iran. As a result, Islam is a relatively new religion in that region, whereas Zoroastrianism has a much longer tradition, even longer than most Persians themselves they would like to admit, due to censorship. So what would happen if Islam never gained a foothold in Persia? What if Persia remained Zoroastrian? Let's take a look at the early Islamic invasion. Islam was an unstoppable force for many years. Byzantium and the Sassanid Empire both weakened themselves prior to the Islamic invasion. Well, that was the perfect opportunity to come and to conquer everyone. Both empires, they were just a cart house that was waiting to fall and to collapse. Well, we can take any point of divergence that would also avoid wars between Byzantium and the Sassanid Empire, because then we would change so much that Islam would just be part of Arabia only. And I think I had so many timelines about that, and I think it would be just unfair to again repeat the same and the same. So I will try to come with another interesting twist. And while I was making my research, I stumbled across an interesting work of someone called Parvaneh Porshariati. Well, I don't know if I can pronounce the name correctly, but this person, she had an interesting work. In her work, she indicated that the Sassanids and the Parthians were in fact in a confederacy, and that around the time of the Islamic invasion, the Parthians, they decided to leave the confederacy for, well, whatever reason. Another interesting point she made was that Mesopotamia was conquered few years earlier, around 628, which was also the same year where the Sassanids and the Parthians, they had their own problems. When looking at other sources, there are also claims about high taxes in Levant, for instance, and that the conquest by the Arab forces was seen as favorable due to less restrictive tax policies. Thus, the point of divergence I propose is that the Parthians, they decided to not leave the confederacy, and the Sassanids, they would thus not face the destabilization, and taxes would also not be raised in Levant and the newly conquered territories, because remember, for a few years the Sassanids, they controlled even parts of Egypt, which is very unknown nowadays. The early Muslims would still conquer large parts of the Middle East, there is no doubt about it. and take Egypt and northern Africa, because the defenses in there, they would be much weaker. However, around the borders of today's Iraq, Iran, the Muslim forces would be repelled by Parthians and a few armies that would have been raised from the steppes. They would be as quick as the Muslim forces due to their horses, but they would have excellent knowledge of the terrain. Something the early Muslim invaders, well, they would be totally lacking. The problems between the Parthians and the Sassanids would be postponed, and the most urgent matter they would face would be the Muslim invasion. Outside of Persia, the Muslim conquest would go on much as in Otial, perhaps even a bit slower or maybe a bit faster, because, well, they would lose against the Persians, and I don't know how the butterfly effect would take place in there. But then we would get an interesting part, the first fitna, or the first Muslim civil war, because, well, the Caliphate was the only Muslim country in that moment. The first fitna, we would see a temporary alliance between Byzantium and the Sassanids to take back some of their lands. The Persians would have it easier than the Byzantines, because Mesopotamia has a good geographical border with the Euphrates and Tigris. The Byzantines would lose many more men, and with such a situation, Byzantium's history unfortunately wouldn't change that much, because the surviving Zoroastrian Persia wouldn't magically solve the problems of Byzantium, right? And actually, well, the Sassanids could even end up becoming once more a problem for the Byzantines. Without Islam in Persia, India would also never get conquered by the Muslims. And thus Islam would perhaps only be in some cities or in some parts in India. But it would have the same result as Christianity had and still has in India nowadays, that only some people might convert, and that these people, they would never really be accepted by the Hindu or Buddhist, depending on where you are, society. And most of them would even have foreign origins as well, so they would not be really native population of India who would be converted, be it forcefully or because they wanted to do so freely. Indonesia and Malaysia could also stay Hindu and Buddhist, because the Muslims would never have any total control in the trade affairs of the Indian Ocean. The same goes for Central Asia, and once the Turks arise, they could stay Tengri for some more time, or eventually they could assimilate when they are in Persia and then convert to Zoroastrianism or perhaps even Christianity, and in there I think they would most likely choose the Nestorian part of Christianity. This means that Byzantium could never really fall, but have, for instance, a Turkic ruler or a Turkish dynasty. Let's call them the Turkopoulos dynasty. Persia, after the conquest of the Turks, would be fragmented, lose control over Mesopotamia to a caliphate again, but then we would see something akin to, for instance, the Seljuk Empire, and after some more time it would split and fall apart, because, well, that always happens with nomadic empires. The Crusades would still happen, only this time Zoroastrians, they would just be grouped together with the Muslims, and the Christians would then even have more tales about more pagans and heathens and people who do the most crazy stuff, because, well, Christianity in that time had a really good talent for spreading very interesting stories about their enemies. But other than that, nothing else would change, so we would not have a Crusader state or something, very crazy. The Mongols would rampage everything but not convert to Islam, and I believe they would also not convert to Zoroastrianism as well. And maybe they could end up becoming Nestorian. Yes, Nestorian could most likely experience a survival, and it would have nothing in common with Catholicism, for instance, and many Mongol and Buddhist elements could be added to it, Zoroastrian elements as well. And we could see a plurality of Tengri, Zoroastrian and Christian Nestorian, as well as Buddhist faith spreading in Central Asia. Also, a very interesting part to know is that the Nestorians, they already since the unification of the Mongols had many Nestorian churches in the capital of Mongolia, which was built by Genghis Khan, I think. The other part, the interesting time will be afterwards, however. Let's give it 100 or 200 more years and Byzantium, a self-proclaimed successor state of the Rashidun Empire, and the Zoroastrian Persia, ruled by a Mongol dynasty, could have many wars against each other. Byzantium would not imitate the Ottoman Empire, but in this timeline the Zoroastrian Persians, they could expand considerably and even take a similar form they took whenever the enemies to their west were weak. The only area they would have to really fear would be Central Asia, but after implementing a military and having guns, that would also not be a problem. Thus, the Zoroastrian Persians, they could even become as big as the Achaemenid Empire was for some time. The next enemy for the Zoroastrians could become the Russians. Why? Well, the Russians, they were always searching for the warm seas, and this would not change, and Russia would still try to do the same policies, and they could even become a Byzantine ally, and this would just be a bigger problem for the Zoroastrians. At the end, I believe that the Middle East would be more diverse than in OTL. We could see the rise of tinier nations, similar in size as Lebanon, for instance, after the decolonization. Or maybe we would never have a colonization in this area and these peoples, they would just free themselves. But the biggest change will be that there won't be Greece or Turkey. In fact, we will have one big Hellenic nation in there, or even, well, the remnants of Byzantium. And depending how global policies will work, the Zoroastrian Persians, they could find a lot of support among intellectuals in a similar move of what we saw with Greece, for instance. Persia could get an alliance with a great power or even a few great powers. They could modernize, even repel the Russians from Central Asia, and we could see the formation of a small bloc around Persia, parts of Mesopotamia, today's northern Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and even the Caucasus. Culturally, the Islamic world will have more Amazigh and Berber influences, even more Tuareg. Islam would split, but I don't know how it could happen or how it would split. While Persia would neither be the Middle East nor Indian, but they would have a very distinct, unique culture that would not be seen as, again, some part of the Islamic world. No, they would be distinctively Persian, Zoroastrian, and become a very respected, long-living nation. And that's where we leave it for now. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.